Dr. KC Huang, thank you very much for giving me some of your time for a conversation.
My pleasure.
Let's start with, what is it that's exciting you the most about work life at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I find that being a professor running a research lab is nonstop excitement, because you get to see young students, young researchers pushing the frontiers of what we know. And I think one of the things that we've gotten involved with recently that I've found really challenging and really inspiring is to think about evolution in the context of our bodies. I think we're very comfortable thinking about evolution in the context of the past, of dinosaurs, and of the way that we can see what has happened before, but not as comfortable in trying to think about what it might mean for us now. And we do a lot of work with the bacteria that live in and on our bodies. And we know that we have created homes for these bacteria that have allowed them to specialize. For instance, if you go to Taronga Zoo and you were to take a sample of the poop from a gorilla, you would find similar bacteria, but the bacteria in their poop would actually be different than the ones in our bodies, and they'd be different in meaningful ways. And so, again, we've become comfortable with the idea that we can see the past and see differences emerge, presumably due to the fact that we eat differently from gorillas. We live different lives, we live in different places. But what we've started to discover is that evolution can happen on much faster timescales, in the timescale of our life, or even shorter. In fact, on the timescale of the trip we are taking here to Sydney. And there was an amazing study that was done that showed that the bacteria that live in Japanese people are more likely to have a set of genes that allow them to digest the main component of seaweed. Wow. Which makes total sense, right? You know, a change in the way you live can change the way that the whole ecosystem functions.
So I guess that might have actually something to do with why we should continually get our microbiome done, because if we change a habit, it will change. It's
why I think many people in the research field are starting to think that we need to be monitoring the microbiome and thinking about it differently, both trying to understand it at a different level and think about what are the engineering tools that we can bring to bear to utilize all of this diversity of behaviors to benefit us as healthy human beings. And what we found is, I mentioned that on the timescale of weeks or even days, a bacterium that comes inside your body can change its genetic code in ways that allow it to cohabitate better with its new host. And part of that is embracing the fact that we don't live as static individuals. We live as part of our environment, and bacteria are part of the way we interact with our environment because they can be transmitted between us. We've become, I have to say, a little bit, scared of the idea of transmission with the pandemic that we've just gone through. But microbes are living in the world around us. There's a very famous microbiologist who used to say that the world is covered in a fine patina of shit. And that is a picture that is hard to get out of your mind, but it really is true. And in fact, we're starting to appreciate that is why humans are as robust as we are, because those microbes have been sort of our canaries that have been going out to sample the environment and coming back and allowing us to adapt to the changing world around us.
You make it sound so fascinating, and I know it is fascinating, but you actually bring it to life. Some of those images are very much living in my head now. Can I ask you, so people often use the excuse, so I love the way that you talk about evolution, and people will often say, oh, our brains can't evolve, oh, we've still got the flight or fight mentality, we haven't evolved that much in our response to many things. How fast have you found, or does research say that our brains have evolved? So our bodies have adapted. You've given some amazing examples of that. How have our brains evolved?
Well, the interesting aspect about evolution that I think is as applicable to microbes as it is to us, but presents a different time scale for microbes, is that evolution at its heart requires the copying of DNA from generation to generation. And that's why we think of it as a process, that has been occurring for millennia, which it has, because that's how long it takes to go back many, many generations and to give DNA and natural selection a chance to sample all the different possibilities. But of course, the aspect about bacteria that's very different is that they grow very fast. There are some bacteria that can create a new daughter cell in 6 minutes.
Whoa.
And so what that means is we can study evolution with bacteria in a totally different regime than the way we think about human evolution or dinosaurs or anything like that. In fact, there's a famous researcher, Richard Lenski at Michigan State University, who started a single test tube of E. coli in 1985. And every day he took all the cells that had grown up and put them back with fresh food and allowed them to grow up again the next day. And he's doing that every day since. And those bacteria have grown for 60,000 generations.
Whoa.
That is the number of generations that humans have existed for. And so he has done an experiment that essentially spans the amount of evolution that has occurred for all of humankind. And what that means is that when we think about bacteria compared with our brains, we have to shift focus. We have to think, okay, things can happen fast and furious. Now, when we think about what can happen to the human body and human genetics, there is certainly the possibility for mutations every time you have a new human is born. But I think we still don't fully understand how quickly a sort of selective pressure from the outside, for instance, how has our body started to adjust to the fact that we eat more processed food? How has it started to adjust to the fact that we live in a cleaner environment, at least in some places? And how has it started to adjust to the fact that we've produced a lot of pollutants and chemicals that may have really deleterious effects on our brains? Have we been able to really adjust to those at a genetic level? We probably haven't had the chance yet, but the more we understand about the human genome through sequencing and through the sort of research that is taking place at Stanford and other places, we're starting to get a sense of what we might be able to do in the future to try to use the potential for genetic engineering in a way that can be ultimately positive, for instance, to affect our brain function.
Totally fascinating. And just that the image of 60,000 generations is quite remarkable. From biology and bacteria and poop and all the things that we've been talking about, you also do some work in diversity. Mm-hmm. And we had a conversation earlier around your take on how we deal with human bias. And I thought it was quite a unique take. Can you share with our listeners what that is and how you work that? Maybe start with the work that you do in diversity. Yeah,
well, so I think it started with taking leadership of the biophysics program, where, as I've told you before, we started out from a point where we had a field and a community that fundamentally lacked diversity, and presented with the challenge of trying to improve that community. We started to introduce many new programs, new policies, and ultimately a new mindset, a new philosophy. And I think what I realized very quickly, especially in self-reflection, is that as a logical scientist who is trying to eliminate bias from our work, that was fundamentally impossible as a human being when thinking about how I view the world around me. It's so easy to ignore the fact that every single interaction we have with people has some bias that is coloring how we react, and that can be a good thing. You know, we as humans, thinking of evolution, you know, we have developed those biases sometimes for reasons that are positive for how we react to situations. But ultimately, when we think about creating a diverse, inclusive environment, those biases, of course, can be incredibly harmful. And so when you start to confront your own biases, it of course gives you the opportunity to try to think about how you can eliminate some of those biases from your own personal interactions. But as you start to think about what it means to start addressing those biases one by one, you realize, I think, very quickly that you're never going to get to a point where the biases are gone. And also, you're always going to be confronting the fact that there are some biases that you want to keep, and those will not also be the same as what you see in all the other people you're interacting with. And so, I think a great example is when we select new students. We have a committee that reads through all the applications. And instead of trying to create a rubric that was free of bias, what we tried to do was to create a community of people on the admissions committee that could bring their own biases in a positive way to act as champions for the people who might otherwise be left behind. You know, we found that amongst the 300 applications that we got for 7 slots, we might have 100 people with a perfect transcript, and we might have 50 people who had perfect test scores. And if we were going to say, well, look, those are the only criteria that matter, we would get a very monolithic population of people. Instead, we have one person on the committee who champions people from small schools because those people have a very different learning experience than someone from a big school. We have someone who champions people who have an extracurricular activity that brings a new element to their personality. For instance, we had an Olympic swimmer who applied, who didn't have the best grades in the world, probably because she was training for 8 hours a day. But you could just tell from the way her research supervisor talked about her, this was a person who would never stop pushing when they came up against the challenge. And we also have people who say, look, people who have really good grades, there is a reason for that. They worked really hard and they did a good job, and they need a champion too. And I've found it very gratifying to see how this creates an environment where everyone can start to realize, once they see a champion for a certain way of thinking, that maybe I should think about championing that group of people as well. And so at the end result, I think it's been a way of transforming bias from a negative into something that we can use to our advantage to create this more inclusive environment.
And that will open up those biases for discussion and everything else. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I could do this for quite some time yet, but I'm sure you've got things to do. Thanks for spending
Thank you,
time with us.
Christina.